Mythos, Homeland, local religion, and temple cults. Just to refresh your memory, what is a pagan? What does pagan refer to? What's the problem with the word paganism? How do pagan gods work? How do different forms of paganism relate to each other? Part 1. Let's visit the local cult. Paganism is the modern catch-all way of describing the many religions that would be displaced and replaced by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Even though the very notion of paganism was a later invention, and no people in the ancient world would have thought of themselves as pagans, there are certain observable patterns between all these different populations from Ireland to Iran, Scandinavia to the Sahara. First, there were gods and other supernatural beings who roughly behaved like humans. Indeed, the gods existed on a kind of continuum with their humans, so there were family and personal gods, demigods, and ancestral gods. There was no solid barrier between the gods and people, or between the gods and nature. Also, paganism was generally much more porous than the modern notion of religion suggests. People could believe in many gods, Polytheism, just one, Monotheism, or they could think that just one god is personally important, Henotheism. And people could participate in foreign cults and intermingle their local gods with the foreign ones, and even bring home those gods of other people without necessarily replacing their own indigenous gods. Now we're going to ask, what did pagans actually do with these gods? What was pagan religious practice? On the whole, as we mentioned last time, most pagan practice was quite local. While there were some gods like the Egyptian Isis, who was worshipped in many different places, that's actually rather odd. Most gods had particular shrines or temples in just one region, or even just one city. On the most local level, paganism was found in the home. We can see personal shrines and idols to specific gods or divinized ancestors in many different places. And so the next step up would be public events where the gods were honored. Their stories could be told, and sacrifices to them could be made. So the gods would have public festivities, like parades. Usually this would mean that there'd be a great procession that would come along through town with the local idol, and people would get to see it. Now remember that pagan gods tended to be rather local. They were found in certain places, not others. And some place where a god was particularly present was in an image, a statue. And often the most important statue of a god would be hidden away in some temple. And so from time to time, the gods would come to pay their people a visit. And so many gods would be hoisted up on wagons or poles and paraded around for all to see. And because animal sacrifice was quite normal, you would get to eat the meat for free, a rare treat for your average pre-modern commoner. We can also see festivals where the gods stayed put, but the people would come to visit. These often involved sorts of contests. The most famous one that's still popular knowledge today would be the Olympic Games. Every 4 years, the city of Olympia would hold a festival to honor Zeus. People from across the Greek-speaking world would travel there to race horses, throw discus, box, run, and wrestle. In the presence of Zeus himself, whose temple was at Olympia, men would try to win honor for their own selves and for their hometowns by doing difficult tasks. And the winner would be themselves somewhat divinized. People would write songs about him and proclaim him a hero. In the year 776, the very first Olympic champion, we are told, was one Coroebus of Elis. He arrived just a local cook and left a demigod. Games like this were common across the Greek cultural landscape, not just at Olympia, and it was, as you can guess, a particularly popular way of honoring your gods. And the gods weren't just into sports. You could encounter and honor your gods in other forms of public events too, and these also tended to be contests. Another famous great example, which survives in a certain form today, is the theater. You could visit the local amphitheater and watch the stories of your gods dramatically reenacted. Remember that in a time when people were mostly illiterate, public art wasn't only a form of entertainment, it was a chance to hear the accounts of the gods, the demigods, and their interactions with humans, often your own ancestors. And there would be contests about who could write the best play. Poetry too worked this way. A poet could call on a certain god, or even get possessed by a god, and spout out verse. And in a precursor to the modern talent show, there would be contests of poetry too. You could invoke your god's voice so well that you would win a prize or honor. The Arabian city of Mecca, we're told, had such a pagan poetry festival. Everyone would gather together at the city shrine once a year, and poetic soothsayers would recite verses. The winner would have his poem stitched onto a cloth that would then hang on the shrine. So not only would his poetry become famous, his words, inspired by a god or by jinn, would now become part of the shrine itself. If you won, your words became immortal. And there were also pagan festivals to the gods that didn't involve contests. In Memphis, Egypt, there was a long-lived celebration of the Apis bull. The local god of Memphis was Ptah, a creator god and a god of craftwork. Well, from time to time, a certain black calf would be born with distinctive white markings, and this calf would be considered the herald of Ptah. This bull, called Apis, was the sign of the god's presence with his people. The birth of such an animal would signal festivities across the region. People would make pilgrimages to see the Apis bull, which was often believed to give blessings and miraculous healings. And when the Apis bull died, the people of Memphis would go into a period of public mourning. And finally, you could always worship a god, even if there wasn't a festival going on, by going to the god's temple. Nearly all ancient pagan cities had a single central temple, and that temple was home to the city's patron. Now, those temples had roughly similar formats across the pagan world, although of course they would differ wildly in size and elaborateness. Now, the most basic temple would just be a room, a sanctum, a holy place. And in that room, the god itself lived in the form of an idol, or a relic, or an image. And there would be priests or other professionals on hand to maintain the temple and its god. In larger, wealthier temples, the kind of temple that, say, a tourist would visit, this room and its god would be found at the center of a number of concentric layers, marked off by walls, doors, pillars, or curtains. In these cases, you generally didn't visit the sanctum unless you were a part of the temple's clergy. And even then, they could only enter it under very specific conditions, say on certain days of the year, or after a ritual preparation. You wouldn't enter the presence of your god lightly. Now, outside of this off-limits sanctum would be the public temple space, where your regular worshippers would go. This is where sacrifices would be offered, prayers would be said, and the clergy would be consulted for their professional opinions on private matters. Outside of that, the outermost layer would be a space for the general public to act freely, and this would usually be the city's marketplaces and theaters too. You could meet your neighbors, buy your groceries, hear some music, and have a drink in the outer layer of the temple. It would sort of be like if modern churches were located in the middle of shopping malls. And it actually makes perfect sense. People naturally congregated at temples, and where crowds go, so do vendors. And plus, if you wanted to bring an offering to the temple, it would be a lot easier just to buy it at the temple. No reason to drag a goat 10 miles to give to the local god. You could just bring some coins and buy a goat there. Let's look at two famous examples. Last time, we mentioned how, for instance, you could usually assume that an Athenian was a worshipper of Athena. Well, Athena's cult centered in Athens' famous temple, the Parthenon. The Parthenon was home to an active cult of Athena from 438 before the Christian calendar to 435 after the Christian calendar began, almost 900 years. The Parthenon was located on a natural outcrop of rock in the exact middle of the old city. It's at the highest point that we find the major sanctum, which is marked off by large pillars. Inside was once a massive statue of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare. Outside of this sanctum was a cluster of other spaces that also served Athena, as well as some other gods. This was the more public ritual space of the temple area. These shrines and altars were near to the goddess herself, but more accessible to the general public. And then, beyond that, on the ground surrounding this great outcrop of rock, were the city marketplaces and some amphitheaters. This was the outer boundaries of the temple. Here's another famous temple, but this one's Egyptian. This is the Temple of Karnak, just outside of Luxor. It's the largest temple in the pagan world by far. It was active in some form for a staggering 2,300 years. Now, in that time it had a lot of different lives, but its oldest and most important role was as a temple for the god Amun. Amun was yet another storm and sky god, often depicted as a horned ram, or as a rather excited fertility god. Remember how the pagan gods can blend together? Amun was later merged with the sun god Re, or Ra, to create Amun-Re. And even after that, he would be blended with Zeus to become Zeus-Amun. But whatever form this god took, the Temple of Karnak followed a pretty standard ancient temple shape. At the very center was a sanctum, where the statue of Amun was located, a space very few would ever enter. Then, just outside of that was a more public courtyard, with more accessible shrines and altars. And then, just outside of that, was the village and the marketplace, where people could gather and shop in preparation for their day spent in proximity to the god Amun. Part 2. Myth, Mystery, and Mysticism. What do all these things have in common? Why worship your gods with concentric local temples, sporting events, songs, plays, and parades? What are all these things doing? Well, the short answer is that they are participation in a myth. Alright, so what's a myth? Now these days, when you say something is a myth, what you're saying is it's something that's often believed that is factually incorrect. A myth is a common misconception. Well, ancient people didn't mean that at all. When an ancient Greek speaker referred to myth, or mythos, they were referring to a story or belief that explains something that is otherwise hidden from your normal understanding. The root of the word mythos means to be shut, or to be shut away. A myth is something that you don't normally see, as if your eyes are shut to it. In other words, a myth is something that shows you something that you can't see, or says something that you can't talk about. And we've met this already. This is the transcendent. There's something undetectable in our world which is deeply important. The truth, ultimate reality, the place where meaning comes from. But we can't get to the transcendent with sensory data, and so we have to use immanent things. Say, a story or a song. That is, a myth. These myths can help us get to the transcendent. And by the way, be aware that religion scholars use the word myth this way. So, if a religious studies scholar talks about how there are Christian myths in the Bible, they're not saying the Bible is false. They're saying the Bible is a collection of materials that Christians claim expose the truth that is not otherwise obvious. Now, I said a moment ago that the pagan forms of worship are participation in a myth. What does that mean? Modern people today often look at these seemingly bizarre stories that pre-modern people told about themselves and dismiss them as pre-scientific foolishness. This is the common dismissive meaning of the word myth. But unfortunately, these conclusions that we tend to make are based on a serious misunderstanding of what myths are. Our hermeneutics of mythical literatures are completely out of line with ancient hermeneutics, and so we tend to read myth as a story that is by definition false, whereas an ancient person would interpret a myth as a story that is by definition true. Moderns misread myths because, and this is very important, the myths aren't meant to be read at all. A myth is meant to be experienced. Rather than thinking of a myth as a very misinformed science textbook, think of it much more like an instruction manual. Myths tell you how to do something, and by doing that something, which we would call a ritual, you come to understand something that you can't say directly, right? Something that's shut away from you. We read myths looking for information, but ancient people read myths looking for experiences. Myths aren't just stories. They are mysteries. Mystery, which comes from the same exact root as the Greek word myth, does not mean what we mean today when we talk about, let's say, a mystery novel. A mystery is something that you need to experience or feel or meditate on. It's something that you need to know, but you can't say it directly. It's kind of like when we refer to the mystery of childbirth. This doesn't mean that we don't know the biological processes that create children, but rather, conception, pregnancy, and birth are experiences that you can't meaningfully understand until you've gone through them yourself. If you want to get it, you have to go through it. This is also why, by the way, Christians to this day refer to many of their common beliefs as mysteries. They're not saying that these are puzzles that you have to decode, but they're reflections on the nature of the universe that you have to experience for yourself. Alright, so how do you participate in a myth? How did a pagan experience a mystery? Well, that's what all the pagan cults were for. People didn't participate in a cult to learn the stories of their myths. They already knew the stories. Instead, they wanted to enter into the world of their myths by having transformative experiences. The word for this, which we have also inherited from the Greek, is ecstasy. Ecstasy is from the Greek word ekstasis, literally meaning to stand outside. So, if you have an ecstatic experience, that means you do something that makes you stand outside of yourself for a moment. You have to put your normal perceptions of the world off to the side temporarily in order to see a bigger picture. And this is what, to this day, music, poetry, and art does. They transport you. They move you, right? They pull you outside of yourself. And this is what sports do. They move both the athlete and the spectator into a zone where their minds don't normally go. And this is what temples do. You literally move into odd spaces where you see, hear, smell, and taste things that you normally don't. And that's why the pagans celebrated their gods with music, poetry, sports, and temples. These things all make you stand outside of yourself in ecstasy. The most striking examples of how this works are in the so-called mystery religions. These are cults where an initiate would do something deliberately unusual to bring them into the world of their myths. The most famous example of this is in the cult of the city of Eleusis. These were then called the Eleusinian Mysteries. It starts with the myth of Persephone. She's a goddess of the springtime, and she is particularly associated with flowers and meadows. One day, while she was innocently out picking flowers, Hades, the god of death himself, showed up and carried her off to the underworld, with a very strong implication that he raped her. Meanwhile, Demeter, the goddess of plants, agriculture and the harvest, who was also Persephone's mother, realized that her daughter was missing. And so Demeter dropped what she was doing to go look for her. Now, with the plant goddess busy looking for her daughter, all of the crops withered and died. Without food to turn into offerings, the gods themselves began to starve. And so the whole natural world was thrown into uproar while Demeter was trying to find her Persephone. Finally, Demeter learned that Hades had kidnapped her. So she pleaded her case to Zeus, her own father and the king of the gods. Demeter wanted to make Hades bring Persephone back to the world of the living. Now Zeus agreed, but there was a problem. While Persephone was in the underworld, she ate 6 pomegranate seeds. Now, because she had eaten the food of the dead, Persephone was now bound to the dead herself. She was allowed to return to life, but she would have to return each year to spend 4 months with Hades before getting to come back to life all over again. Now, if we just read this myth as a mystery in the common sense of the term, it just reads like bad science. Every year all the crops die for a while and the flowers go away because Demeter is looking for Persephone, and the plants remain dead for 4 months a year because Persephone is with Hades in the underworld again. And once winter is over, Persephone returns and brings with her all the new growth of the springtime. Now, of course, ancient pagans in Eleusis actually did believe in this as a kind of proto-science. But that wasn't the main point of the myth. The point of the myth was to experience it as mystery, and that involved the local cult, the mystery religion. At the end of each summer, people from all across the Mediterranean world would come to Eleusis for a 10-day-long initiation into their cult. First, they would ritually bathe themselves in the sea, and then walk on a long procession for several days through a number of towns, feasting at night in cemeteries and yelling playful obscenities into the darkness. Finally, they would come to Eleusis, several miles inland. Then, the initiates would stay up all night and be given a fermented drink called kekion. Now, we don't know exactly what kekion was, but it was probably some kind of psychoactive substance, a hallucinogen. So, after walking for days and partying, the initiates had to stay up all night long, and they started having psychedelic experiences which may have gone on for days. Then, the priests would bring out the normally hidden idols of their temple, and their exhausted, sleep-deprived, and now very high initiates would catch a glimpse of something normally shut away. That is, they literally saw the mythos. Now, we don't know exactly what the initiates saw, but it was probably some kind of play where the priests would reenact the story of Persephone using the idols as their props. Then, the following morning, the initiates would perform a sacrifice, feast with it, and go home, forbidden to tell anyone what they saw that night. Alright, so why did they do all this stuff? First, it's a reenactment of the story itself. Like Demeter wandered around looking for Persephone, the initiates' procession wandered around the countryside on the way to Eleusis. Then, when they reached their goal, they, like Persephone, had to consume an unusual food. They had to deliberately interject a corruption into themselves by drinking something. And that food comes at a very high cost. But the experience provided them with ecstasy. It pulled the initiates out of their normal lives to help them understand something that is frightening and beautiful and deeply important. You see, it isn't just the gods who go to the underworld, and it isn't just the springtime that dies occasionally. We humans, the initiates themselves, were doomed to travel the long and wandering road that ended in the land of the dead. And there we would have to barter with the gods and nature against the forces of death. And so the story of Persephone and Demeter isn't just some story about nature. It's a story about us. The myth isn't about just how the gods or nature work. Anyone can just tell you that. The myth is the story about how you work. How young women fear sexual violation. How parents fear the helplessness of their children. How powerful and violent the despair of a mother can be. And how we're all doomed to get dragged down into the world of the dead. Right? Those are the mysteries. The myth is a participation in the most visceral, wonderful, and terrifying parts of what it means to be a human. And just to be clear, the ancient people knew they were doing this. Here, for instance, is just a short passage from the Roman philosopher Dio, where he quotes the Greek philosopher Aristotle, who lived a few centuries earlier. Now, both Dio and Aristotle are scientifically minded guys. They're logicians, they're material scientists. They don't care about superstitions or other such nonsense. And yet, both Dio and Aristotle claim that it is critically important to become an initiate in cultic practice. Dio starts by saying cultic practice is like purifying and polishing your mind. He actually compares it to writing a poem, where you need to arrange and rearrange yourself in order to say something in just the right way. When the poet gets it right, after a lot of practice, the poem can say something very subtle and very complicated, very precisely. It can reveal what is hidden. Cultic practices are like that, like poems. Cultic practices are not about arriving at some new data or some new information, but coming to a deeper understanding, making your mind more fit. It is like the leap of a man mad or possessed, the attainment of a goal without running the race, the passing beyond reason without previous exercise of reasoning. It is like Aristotle's view that men being initiated, meaning into cults, have not a lesson to learn, but an experience to undergo, and a condition into which they must be brought. A myth isn't just pre-modern science, but it's almost a kind of psychotherapy. You already know what you need to know, you just have to understand it more deeply. You have to stand outside of yourself in ecstasy, and then you'll get it. The word that we've inherited for this is mysticism. Again, from the exact same root as myth and mystery, mysticism is the art of seeking out direct experiences of greater or deeper realities. And like myth and mystery, mysticism has been bastardized in the modern period to mean something vaguely magical or maybe even some kind of pseudo-spiritual trickery. But when religious studies scholars talk about mysticism, they mean experiences that people undergo to gain a deeper understanding of the world and themselves. A theophany is mysticism. Practicing yoga in the strict Hindu sense is mysticism. Buddhist meditation is mysticism. And bathing in the sea, walking for days on end to Eleusis, and then deliberately ingesting a psychotropic substance in order to directly encounter your gods, that's mysticism. Just one more famous cult. This one's at the city of Delphi. In Delphi was a famous cult of women who were prophets. A prophet is someone who speaks for, prophetes, a god, right? Someone who relays a message. They open their mouth and the will of a god comes out. Now people would go to Delphi and ask the prophet a question about their lives or their future or their business. And then the prophet would sit on a tripod over a fissure in the ground, inhaling fumes, which appeared to put her into a sort of trance. See, mysticism. Then, the prophet would give you an answer to your question, but it would be in a deliberately irrational form. The answer wouldn't make any logical sense. But, over the prophet's head were instructions for understanding her mysterious answers, to understand what the god was telling you to do. It said, simply, Henotheism, know yourself. Part 3. Gods of everything. Paganism wasn't all pluralism, sports cults, and psychedelic freakouts. It was a serious political transformation at work, as the local political environment of North Africa, Europe, and the Middle East became, well, less local. That is, when we start to see massive political structures, empires, paganism would become less about regional cults and more about imperial cults. People living in an empire don't have to just be concerned with their local worldviews. They have to be concerned with what people do in faraway lands. Now, it was one thing to be an Athenian, who was roughly religiously indifferent to religion in, say, Carthage. You were welcome to be curious about their religion if you wanted to, and you could even dabble in it, or just fully ignore it. But what happens when an empire arrives, and both you and the Carthaginians have the same rulers? Well, your gods are going to begin to reflect this. The bigger your notion of your world, the bigger your gods become. And so, some village in the middle of Libya is free to worship the god of the local temple and not care about the gods of England. But if you're both part of the same empire, like for instance the Roman Empire, there was clearly some kind of power that overarches both places, the power of the emperor. It stands to reason then, the god of the emperor, the Caesar, has power in both Libya and England. He clearly is powerful in many places. Let's go all the way back to the 14th century, before the Christian calendar. In Egypt, the many gods of the land had their local cults and private family shrines. And the pharaoh, the ruler, had his own personal god, we met already, Amun. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, the pharaoh Amenhotep IV outlawed the cult of Amun, and all the other cults too. He said there was only one god you had to worry about, the Aten, the sun. The Aten stood over all other gods, rendering them effectively useless. Only the Aten had real power, because the sun stands over all creation. Its rays touch everything. So even if you thought the other gods still existed, they were inferior to the sun. Your gods were local. My god shines everywhere. And the pharaoh even changed his own name from Amenhotep, Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, the one who is useful for the Aten. Now, there's political power in this, of course. If the Aten was the one god alone, and that one god was the god of the pharaoh, you really had to be on Pharaoh's good side. And it also meant that everywhere was the pharaoh's domain. So just because the pharaoh didn't have armies in, let's say, Ethiopia, he could rightfully claim Ethiopia as his own if he chose to. They live under the sun too. Every local god lives beneath the Aten. But this imperial solar cult wasn't to last. People liked their local gods, and as soon as Akhenaten died, the Aten cult disappeared too. The old gods came right back. Now, around the 6th century BCE, something similar happened in Persia. This lasted a little bit longer. The Persian Empire became home to the international religion called Zoroastrianism. A prophet, one who speaks for a god, named Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, preached that everyone, everywhere, lived in the middle of a great cosmic battle between the forces of good and evil. He would say the forces of light and darkness. All of the many supernatural powers of the universe were involved, but standing over them all was a single good god of light, Ahura Mazda. And notice how he is depicted. He's like the sun. Just like the Aten cult in Egypt, Ahura Mazda's power shines on people everywhere. He's the ruler of all things. And in the 4th century BCE, something similar happened yet again, now on even a larger scale. In Macedonia, a young king named Alexander III arose out of obscurity and began a massive military invasion of, well, everywhere. By the age of 30, he was the emperor of what was then the world's largest empire, controlling half of the Asian landmass and a good deal of North Africa too. And everywhere that this Alexander went, he declared himself a new god. In his own Greek culture, he was made the son of Zeus. In Egypt, where Zeus was already equated with the pharaoh's god, Amun, Alexander became a manifestation of Amun. And in art and on his coins, he appears with the horns of a ram, the ram being the animal of Amun. For centuries, by the way, the two-horned one was just another way of saying Alexander of Macedon, and in some languages it still is. Everywhere he went, Alexander merged his own cult with the cult of the local gods. Now, Alexander wasn't the only god, but he was the god everywhere. And where they didn't accept him as a god, Alexander destroyed the local cults as political rivals. When he got to Persia, Zoroastrianism proved a particular problem, because they claimed to have a god of everything too. And one more time, 2 centuries after that, it happened again with the Roman emperors, the Caesars. Now, the Caesars were a little bit more cautious than Alexander was. With very few exceptions, they left the local cults to themselves. It just made good political sense. But the genius of the emperor, right? The emperor's personal spirit was still the god who had power everywhere. You could keep your local cults, but remember who was the real god of every nation. Thinking this way exposed a kind of religious void. If there were countries that were everywhere, well then there must be gods of everything. There have to be gods of every people in every land. And during the 1st to the 4th centuries of the Christian calendar, a number of local gods, who had been around forever, were suddenly international gods, gods of everybody. Mithras, a once minor Eastern sun god, remember the sun shines everywhere, made his way to Rome, and his mystery cult held sway over the whole empire. The cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. Here we go, the sun again. It became an official cult of the Emperor Aurelian. Sun and sky gods that were in no way new, thanks to widespread and stable empires, were now transforming from the gods of local temples into universal, imperial gods, gods of all lands. And the most successful one of these was the god of the temple in Jerusalem. Some questions. How did pagan worship work? What were its many forms? What is the ancient meaning of the words myth, mystery, ecstasy, and mysticism? How did local pagan gods transform into gods of everything?